Hello and welcome to my next video. Today we're going to talk about fiscal policy, but before we get into the real meat of the topic of fiscal policy, I want to backtrack a little, fill in some gaps, and then also do a little bit of rerun on some discussion. So fiscal policy really came about as a result of the Keynesian perspective. And so the Keynesian perspective is the idea that the private economy is unstable. When I say private, I'm talking about non-government. So I'm not talking about individuals. I'm talking businesses would be part of the private economy. So the private economy is unstable in the short run, and Keynes actually even called it, in his idea, it was because of animal spirits on the part of business people. See, in his perspective, investment spending was very volatile. It changed a lot because it was based on expectations of future profits. So businesses one day might think they're going to have great profits if they build a new factory, for example. And so they undertake investment spending. And then the next day they may hear some news that, oh, things are not going to be so great. So they pull back on plans for building that new factory. So it's as if business people had animal spirits, and we can apply that to consumers too. But Keynes mainly focused on business investment spending. And if there's a lot of volatility in some of the components of spending, then that means that aggregate demand curve's jumping all around, or the aggregate expenditure curve in the Keynesian perspective. And so the economy is unstable. And even if we got to so-called equilibrium in the economy, that's not necessarily equal to full employment. Now, this is different than the previous thinking, and actually thinking after Keynes, about the fact that if the labor markets are all in equilibrium, then by definition we're at full employment. Everybody that wants to work is working at the going wage rates. But given this perspective that the private economy is unstable, as opposed to being very stable from the previous perspective, and then the newer, what we would call new classical or neoclassical perspective, because of the belief in markets being very effective. But because of the instability built into the system, it's the role of government to be the spender of last resort. That's really the Keynesian notion right there. Government should take up the slack if there is slack in the economy, because what causes recessions primarily is a drop in aggregate demand. That's a drop in total spending. And so government needs to step in and take up the slack. So the government can do that in a couple ways. One is if we're in a recession, government can just increase their own spending to shift aggregate demand curve to the right. Or they can indirectly increase spending on the part of businesses and consumers by lowering taxes. So this is where the government is intentionally changing their spending and or tax policies in order to affect the economy, and that's called discretionary. In other words, the government's doing it at their discretion on purpose in order to impact the economy. Impacting the economy through spending and taxes is fiscal policy. So that's discretionary fiscal policy. Now, to further flesh this out, we need to rewind and recall that spending multiplier. Remember, the idea of the spending multiplier is that some initial injection of more spending or a decrease in the level of spending, that's not all the impact on the economy. That will set into a series of events, into motion a series of events where the total change will be much larger than the initial change. And that all boils down to the idea that one person's spending is another person's income. Recall, we went through the marginal propensity to consume, the marginal propensity to save, then went through the spending multiplier. Spending multiplier has many names depending on the textbook. Sometimes it's just called the Keynesian multiplier. Sometimes it's just called a multiplier. I usually just call it the multiplier. So that's the idea behind the multiplier. Now, let's apply this to the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. So let's suppose that we're at point A here. That means the economy is at full employment. Recall, full employment is always consistent with the level of real GDP where the long-run aggregate supply curve hits the horizontal axis. So in this example, full employment would be consistent with a level of real GDP of 17 trillion. At point A, we're there. Now we've had a little inflation because it's at 105, the price index, rather than 100, but things are pretty good. Things are rocking along pretty good. And then for some reason, there's an initial drop in aggregate demand, in other words, total spending from AD1 to AD2. Now, this sets off a series of a chain of events, that spending multiplier. That's not where it stops at point B. There's rounds and rounds of a decrease in spending, and so we ultimately end up at point E. The economy is in a recession if this has lasted over 6 months. So we're at point E. That says we're actually producing in the economy about $16 trillion worth of goods and services, and therefore that's how much income there is in the overall economy. In order to support full employment, in order for everyone to be working at the prevailing wage rate that wants to work, we would need to produce 17 trillion. So there is a GDP gap, the difference between 16 trillion and 17 trillion. So we call that the GDP gap. However, we have to backtrack just a little, and something that I really haven't spelled out, but in order for the aggregate expenditures model, yes, we didn't really talk about that too much. But for the multiplier numbers to work out the way they do using the aggregate expenditures model, you have to assume that prices are not changing. We don't have inflation or deflation. So how would we handle that on this graph? Well, if we initially are at point A, prices are not changing, then we would have to assume they're not, but we'd have to assume they would be like the price level is still 105. And so if that were the case, we can almost think about that flat curve on the short run average supply curve going this flat through here. And so we would actually have to calculate what the government needs to do based on 15 trillion, not 17 trillion. So the GDP gap is the difference in where we actually are and where we should be. But we have something that I will call, in some books, called the AD shortfall. And that AD shortfall is actually 2 trillion. Hope that makes sense to you. So let me kind of spell that out just a little. So again, the GDP gap is the difference between 16 trillion, point E, and 17, where we need to be. But the shortfall is the difference between 17 trillion and 15 trillion, where the economy would have been if prices were sticky, if prices had not changed. And so to calculate what government needs to do, we don't just look at the GDP gap, which is the simplified version, but we look at the AD shortfall. So the AD shortfall is 2 trillion. And if we assume that the MPC is 0.75, I know that's low, but it's a nice number to deal with. Hopefully you recall that the way you calculate the spending multiplier is 1 over the MPS. Well, if the MPC is 0.75, the MPS is 0.25, and 1 divided by 0.25, or I'm a fractions kind of guy, I would think of that as 1 divided by 1/4. Well, when you have fractions, you invert and multiply. And so what actually is going to have to happen is that AD shortfall, 2 trillion, we're going to have to divide that by 4 to find out how much the initial change in government spending needs to be. And that would be 500 billion in order to get us back to full employment. Now, if we're going to use taxes, we have to use a different multiplier that's called the tax multiplier. And the good news is the tax multiplier is always 1 less than the spending multiplier. I have the simple spending multiplier in letters here. Now that's what the SSM stands for. Now let me explain that. A lot of textbooks will show a much more complicated formula, but I promise you it all boils down to the same valuation with a caveat on the side. So why do we subtract 1, the spending multiplier from 1? it's because that when you are changing taxes, it's not like people initially have more or less income if taxes go down more, if taxes go up less, but it's that they get to keep more of their income. And so the first initial round of spending, that dollar injection into the economy, that doesn't happen. It's just the effects after the change in the taxes. So hopefully that makes a little sense in terms of why the tax multiplier is you subtract one, you subtract the spending multiplier from one to get that value. So in our example, if the spending multiplier is 4, we'd do 1 minus 4, that's a negative 3. And so we take that AD shortfall, 2 trillion, divided by that tax multiplier of negative 3, and that gives us 2/3 of a billion, or 0.67 trillion. Now, the negative sign, let me explain that. The negative sign says which way we need to change taxes by. So in this case, since it's a negative, taxes need to be reduced by that 670 billion, or the 0.67 trillion. So that's discretionary, expansionary fiscal policy. That is used. This is also called fiscal stimulus. That's another term for it. When the government feels like it needs to try to impact the economy and pull it out of a recession, increase government spending and or cut taxes. Now, there's something called a balanced budget multiplier that always equals 1, and that says if government wants to stimulate the economy out of a recession by increasing spending, but they want to pay for it by also increasing taxes, the multiplier effect will be 1. In other words, if the actual shortfall is $2 trillion, then government would actually have to increase government spending by $2 trillion and increase taxes, I should say, by $2 trillion. So it's not nearly as powerful, but it keeps us out of running up huge deficits and then piling on debt. That's not typically used, quite honestly. So let's go there, though. So typically what you see with expansionary fiscal policy, fiscal stimulus, is the government will run deficits in order to increase spending and or cut taxes. So keep that in mind for later. Now,